It all happened so fast in that small courtroom. The judge, Judge Michael Browning, wore a deep scowl on his face as he fixed his eyes on the ragged-looking man standing in front of him. Everyone in the room could feel the heat of his anger, like the air itself was charged with electricity. "So, you dare to come into my courtroom dressed like this, unkempt, and smelling like you haven't showered in weeks?" Judge Browning's voice boomed across the silent hall, bouncing off the tall walls and echoing in the ears of everyone present. People began to shuffle uncomfortably in their seats, because he wasn't done yet. "You clearly don't have respect for the law," he shouted. "You don't have respect for yourself, and I don't have time for any of your excuses." The homeless man, Timothy Grant, swallowed hard, his scruffy beard trembling in sync with his quivering lips. Judge Browning's glare was as sharp as a knife. Timothy tried to respond, but the words got stuck somewhere between his racing heart and his dry throat. The judge took his silence as a challenge. "Are you trying to say something, Mr. Grant?" The judge snarled, leaning forward. Timothy's eyes darted around, searching for anything familiar, anything comforting. But the rows of spectators and the painted ceiling only reminded him how alone he felt. Then, in a swift moment that nobody saw coming, a piece of paper slipped from the stack of files on the table next to the prosecutor. The assistant prosecutor picked it up and froze. An odd, stunned look came over her face. Judge Browning noticed her expression and raised an eyebrow. "Is there something you want to share with the court?" he asked, sounding impatient. She stood up, cleared her throat, and said, "Your Honor, it appears Mr. Grant is—" She paused, looking at Timothy with wide eyes. His is a decorated war veteran. The gasps in the courtroom were as loud as thunder. One juror near. Arlie dropped his pen, and a few people rose halfway out of their seats. Judge Browning's face turned from solid anger to sudden shock, his mouth slightly open as if he had been hit by a fast-approaching car. He blinked, once, twice, trying to process the words. A hush fell over everyone. The tension was so thick you could almost taste it in the air. The judge loosened his tie and opened his mouth to speak, but before he could say anything at all, the bailiff took a step forward, also staring at the paper in the assistant prosecutor's hand. Murmurs began to break the silence, and the judge's lips trembled, as though his entire world had turned upside down. Suddenly, the judge spoke again, his voice a little softer, though still shaky. "Is this true?" No one knew what was going to happen next. Everyone's eyes were glued on Timothy Grant, the homeless man who had just been embarrassed in front of the entire court. Judge Browning's gavel trembled in his hand, and you could see the confusion and regret swirling in his eyes. The question filled the room like an echo, begging for someone to answer. That's when Timothy took a deep breath, and a tear formed in the corner of his eye. He was about to speak. Then, a sudden wave of murmuring rippled through the crowd, creating a suspenseful hush that blanketed everything. No one moved, no one spoke again, but hearts drummed inside chests like unstoppable clock hands. Would the judge realize his mistake? Would Timothy find any measure of respect from the man who had just yelled at him so mercilessly? In the next moment, the judge's eyes caught Timothy's, and they locked gazes. The entire courtroom felt like it was on the brink of something explosive, something that might change all of their lives forever. Many weeks earlier, Timothy Grant wandered the streets of Madison, Wisconsin, feeling lost, hungry, and uncertain if there was any hope left in his life. He trudged along the sidewalk, his boots worn down, soles flapping with every limp he took. He had a layer of dirt on his skin that smelled of exhaust fumes, old paper, and tired dreams. The day was hot and sticky, and it seemed like not a single soul was willing to help him. People rushed by with headphones on, or they tapped away at phones, not wanting to see the desperate man in shabby clothes. Timothy was used to it. He had grown accustomed to feeling invisible, as if the city swallowed him whole every morning and spat him out every night. He tried to keep to the quieter neighborhoods, where fewer people would stare at him. Sometimes he managed to pick up soda cans or any bit of scrap metal to sell for a few cents. Other times, he rummaged through trash cans in the alley, hoping to find a half-eaten sandwich he could salvage. On rare days, a kind passerby would hand him $1 or $2, but it never lasted long. He slept in boxes near store dumpsters or under the occasional bridge. Winters were the worst. The cold would slip into his bones like shards of glass. Sometimes he thought about the old days, when he wore crisp uniforms and marched with pride, with ribbons pinned to his chest. His heart would ache with a deep longing. What had gone wrong in his life to end up here? Those memories flickered in his head, while he sat one evening against the grey brick wall of an abandoned building. The sun was setting, painting the sky in melting oranges and pinks. Timothy closed his eyes and let the memories flood back. Scenes of old missions in faraway lands, the voices of his fellow soldiers, the explosions that rattled the ground, the tears shared for fallen comrades. He remembered the day a general pinned a shiny medal onto his jacket for bravery under fire. He could still recall the claps and cheers from his squad mates. Once upon a time, he had felt important, honored even. And now, that life seemed like a dream. A rumbling in his stomach brought him back to the harsh present. He had nothing to eat that day besides a few leftover crackers. He got up, dusted himself off, and limped toward the more populated part of town, hoping to find a spot where he could ask for spare change. As he turned the corner, he saw bright store signs, bus stops, and rows of cars honking at each other. He also noticed the police. Usually, Timothy tried to keep away from them. Officers often told him to move along, or sometimes threatened to arrest him for loitering. He still remembered his training, how he was taught to keep calm in tense situations. Even so, with each step, his heart pounded. He found a corner near a grocery store. People came in and out with carts full of food. Some had children trailing behind them, whining for candy. Timothy placed his tattered cap on the ground and held a small sign that read, "Anything helps, thank you." He kept his eyes on the ground, not wanting to meet the judgmental looks. A few pennies landed in his cap, some nickels too. After about 2 hours, he had enough for a cheap meal from a nearby convenience store, a microwavable burrito and a small carton of chocolate milk. He hurried inside, his stomach grumbling. The cashier handed him the change silently, perhaps afraid to say a word to the tired, scruffy man. When he returned to the alley behind the store, Timothy found a spot behind a stack of broken pallets. It wasn't the best place to eat, but at least he could be alone. He took his first bite of the burrito, still cold in the middle, and tried not to notice the stale taste. The chocolate milk felt like a treat. It reminded him of home many years ago when his mother would offer him sweets after he finished his chores. He gulped down the milk in a few quick sips. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and dark clouds quickly rolled in, swallowing the color out of the sky. Soon, big drops of rain pelted the ground. Timothy huddled against the wall, pulling his jacket tight around him. If the rain got too bad, he might have to find a doorway to sleep in. His eyes stung with exhaustion. He rarely slept well anymore, always ready to spring up if the police or an angry store manager showed up to yell at him. He looked up at the sky, the water streaming down his face, mixing with tears he didn't remember shedding. He wondered how it was possible that he could make such a difference in the world once, only to come home and find no place to belong. Eventually, the rain eased. Timothy found an old piece of cardboard and a blanket left near a dumpster. He set them up as a makeshift bed. The blanket stank of mildew, but at least it was some cover. Wrapping himself up, he let the gentle patter of leftover drizzle lull him into a dreamless sleep. In the morning, he woke up stiff and cold, feeling a sudden chill, even though the sun was already out. He groaned and stretched, rubbing his sore shoulder, the same one that was injured years ago. He realized he couldn't keep going on like this. Maybe the local shelter had space for him, or at least a meal. He gathered his few belongings, which included some old dog tags he never got rid of, and made his way downtown. At the local shelter, which had chipped paint on the windows and the faint smell of old coffee, Timothy waited in line for what felt like hours. The line moved slowly, as folks in ragged clothes clutched the hope of a warm meal or a bed for the night. He noticed some of them looked even worse off than him, eyes sunken, clothes in tatters. When he finally reached the front desk, a tired-looking volunteer checked a list on a clipboard. "I'm sorry," she said gently. "We're all full for the night." "B. You can wait to see if anyone else leaves." Timothy's face fell, but he nodded. He was used to disappointment. He found a folding chair in a corner of the lobby. Nearby, a family with small kids was waiting anxiously, the mother trying to calm her crying toddler. Timothy's heart ached for them. He wanted to help, but he had nothing of money, no space, not even an extra blanket. He watched the staff scramble to find them a room, and finally, after many hushed conversations, the family was led inside. Timothy was happy for them, but his chances at a bed that night became slimmer. He decided to stay for the free dinner they were offering and worry about where to sleep later. Dinner was a simple bowl of soup, bread, and a small piece of fruit. Timothy sipped the soup, tasting more water than flavor, but it was something in his stomach, and for that he was grateful. He left the shelter after thanking the volunteers, even though many barely noticed him. The sky had grown dark again, so Timothy found a bus stop with an overhang to rest under. There were no benches, but he leaned against the glass enclosure, sliding down to a sitting position. The city lights gleamed in the puddles on the sidewalk. As he dozed, he was startled by the sound of squealing tires. A bright light flashed into his eyes. A police cruiser pulled over, and 2 officers stepped out. They looked him up and down with stern faces. "You can't sleep here," the taller officer barked. Timothy raised his hands to show he wasn't a threat. "I'm sorry, officer. I just need a place for tonight." But the officer cut him off. "If you don't move along, we'll have to take you in for loitering." Timothy sighed and stood up slowly. The officer's face softened a bit when he saw Timothy's limp and the dog tags peeking out from Timothy's shirt collar. For a moment, the officer hesitated. Then, his partner stepped forward and said, "We'll drop you at the next shelter, but you can't stay here." They gestured for Timothy to climb into the back seat. Relieved that they weren't going to lock him up, Timothy followed instructions. During the quiet drive, no one spoke. Timothy kept his gaze on the wet streets, the reflections of traffic lights dancing across puddles. He felt grateful for the small kindness, but also ashamed that he had to be escorted like a criminal. The new shelter they brought him to wasn't much better. An older man with a raspy voice at the desk told him to wait with a group of other homeless men. Some looked like they struggled with illnesses, while others seemed to have long, complicated stories of how they ended up here. Timothy didn't talk much, preferring to keep to himself. After about an hour, he was told there was no available bed for him. Feeling the sting of rejection yet again, he thanked them and walked out into the night. Several nights went by in a similar pattern, searching for a safe spot to sleep, rummaging for food, and avoiding trouble. Then, a fateful evening arrived when Timothy was too exhausted to keep walking. He chose a spot in an old construction site that was behind a fence but easy to slip through. He settled down on a crate, hoping to remain unnoticed. It was better than a sidewalk, at least. But at sunrise, he was discovered by a security guard who patrolled the site. The guard didn't hesitate to call the police, accusing Timothy of trespassing. Despite Timothy's pleas, he was taken away in a squad car, his wrists cuffed behind him. Now, Timothy sat in a holding cell, feeling the pang of shame wash over him like a cold wave. He sank, stared at the dull walls, trying not to pay attention to the buzzing fluorescent lights overhead. The next morning, an officer told him he'd be going before a judge because he had violated the city's trespassing laws. Timothy tried to stay calm, but deep down, he was terrified. He had never been on this side of the law before. Long ago, he had protected the law, and now it seemed to be turning against him. Soon enough, 2 officers led Timothy into the courtroom. He stood in front of the judge's bench, shoulders hunched, afraid of what might happen. That's when he first saw Judge Michael Browning, a tall, broad-shouldered man with grey hair parted neatly to the side. The judge's stern eyes seemed to bore right into Timothy, making him feel 2 feet tall. The bailiff read Timothy's name, and the charge, criminal trespassing. Timothy tried to explain that he was just looking for somewhere to sleep, but the judge slammed his gavel once, silencing him. Judge Browning sighed loudly and began a scolding that made Timothy's face burn red. "This is my courtroom, and I will not tolerate vagrancy or lawlessness," the judge said. His voice echoed around the room, making it feel like every pair of eyes was on Timothy. The judge went on about how Timothy should be ashamed of himself, and how there were other options in the city, and how he was tired of seeing people like Timothy always ending up in front of him. The words stung more than Timothy cared to admit. He felt each insult like a punch in the gut. Little did Judge Browning know, the man he was berating was a former soldier who had risked his life for his country. All Timothy's service records, his medals, and his commendations were just words on pieces of paper, filed away somewhere. In that tense moment, it didn't matter that Timothy had once been a hero. He was now just a homeless man who had broken the law. With every passing second, Timothy felt smaller and smaller. And that led to this moment right here, right now, when the prosecutor's assistant happened to catch sight of Timothy's records. The truth spilled out, and a stunned hush fell upon the courtroom. Judge Browning could only stare, grappling with the sharp sting of realization that the man he had just torn apart in front of everyone was, in fact, a decorated war veteran. The same judge who prided himself on fair judgments had misjudged Timothy in the worst way possible. Time seemed to stand still as Timothy opened his mouth to speak. He wanted to say something, to explain, to ask for compassion. But before he could utter a single word, the doors at the back of the courtroom burst open. A middle-aged woman in a neat business suit hurried in, whispering to an officer who escorted her. The woman's eyes darted to Timothy, then to Judge Browning. Her face was flushed, as though she had been running. The judge's head snapped around toward her, frowning at the interruption. A tense silence filled the space, everyone waiting for someone else to speak. The woman took a few steps forward, her heels clicking on the polished floor. She cleared her throat. "Your Honor," she began, "I'm sorry for interrupting, but I have urgent information regarding Mr. Grant." She glanced at Timothy, who stared back, confused. Judge Browning, still reeling from the news about Timothy's military service, narrowed his eyes. "What do you have to share with the court?" His voice was steadier now, though an undercurrent of guilt rattled beneath each word. The woman opened a folder she was holding. Her fingers trembled slightly. "There's more to Mr. Grant's story," she said. "In addition to his decorated record, I have proof that he has been seeking assistance from the VA hospital, but—" She paused, swallowing hard. There have been complications. Before she could finish her explanation, another voice shouted from the back of the room, "Hez lying! Hez just doing this for sympathy!" Heads whipped around, trying to find the source of the accusation. A husky man in a dark jacket stood up, glaring at Timothy with cold eyes. It wasn't clear who he was or why he was there, but his words sliced through the air like a knife. Shocked whispers erupted among the crowd. Some people shouted for the man to sit down. Others seemed to agree with him, nodding slightly. The bailiff moved quickly to quiet the disruption, but the damage was already done. Suspicion and confusion swirled through the court like a sudden storm. Was Timothy truly a war veteran deserving of empathy, or was he a fraud looking for an easy break? Judge Browning clenched his jaw, uncertain of how to regain control of his courtroom. Timothy's face flushed, his breath came in uneven gasps. Everything he feared was happening. He was being doubted, judged, and put on display like an animal in a cage. Another voice piped up. "Wait, if he's a veteran, show us some proof. Where's his ID? Where's his dog tags?" The woman in the business suit tried to speak over the crowd, but her voice drowned in the clamor of voices demanding answers. Judge Browning banged his gavel, shouting for order, but people were too riled up. Timothy stood there, pinned in place by a spotlight of suspicion he had never asked for. Fear twisted inside him, pulling him back into memories of chaos and confusion he had experienced in combat zones far from home. In that explosive moment of noise and shouting, the hush of minutes ago seemed like a distant memory. Timothy closed his eyes, trying to steady himself. He knew how quickly panic could seize him if he let it, but he also knew he needed to speak up, needed to stand up for himself. He felt a burst of energy well up in his chest, fueling him with a sense of purpose. He looked at the judge, who was shouting for everyone to quiet down. Then Timothy's gaze shifted to the crowd, to the suspicious faces and the few sympathetic ones. He saw the assistant prosecutor holding the slip of paper that had changed everything. And he saw the woman in the business suit, her lips pressed tight, still clutching her folder of documents. Suddenly, he felt a surge of courage he hadn't felt in years. Timothy reached into the collar of his worn-out shirt and pulled out the chain with his dog tags. With a trembling hand, he held them up for all to see. The metal caught the overhead lights, glinting as if answering a silent call. This was his story, his life, and for better or worse, he would fight to claim it. That's when a voice near the front of the court, sounding high-pitched with alarm, cried out, "Your Honor, watch out!" Timothy spun around just in time to see the husky man in the dark jacket pushing through the crowd, a furious look on his face. Judge Browning tried to slam his gavel again, but it was too late. The man lunged forward, and the entire courtroom erupted in screams. Chairs toppled over, people scrambled to get away, and everything descended into a flurry of chaos. In the middle of it all, Timothy stood frozen, dog tags clenched in his hand, as the man charged toward him with wild eyes. Timothy heard his own heartbeat roaring in his ears, and his training instincts kicked in like a reflex. He turned slightly, positioning himself in a defensive stance. But before he could react, two bailiffs and a police officer tackled the raging man, bringing him crashing to the ground mere feet from Timothy. The man's fingers clawed at the air, fury etched on his face, yelling something incoherent. Judge Browning rose from his seat, slamming the gavel repeatedly in an attempt to restore order. "Everybody, remain calm," he shouted. The prosecutor's assistant stumbled back, nearly knocking over a large stack of papers. The onlookers huddled together, frightened by the sudden outbreak of violence. Timothy found himself trembling, not just from the shock of almost being attacked, but also from the flood of memories that soared back, the chaos of battle, the unpredictability of life on the streets. Within seconds, the bailiffs had the man pinned down. He was shouting insults at Timothy, claiming that people like him were fakers who took advantage of the system. Timothy's body shook with adrenaline. He saw Judge Browning's expression shift rapidly from confusion to horror, then to fierce authority as he ordered the man to be removed from the courtroom. The officer dragged the man out, still yelling threats and curses that echoed in the hallway until the doors finally slammed shut behind them. The room fell into a stunned silence once more, but it was a different kind of silence this time, one charged with the weight of what had just happened. Everyone looked at Judge Browning, whose face was pale, eyes darting between Timothy and the door. At last, clearing his throat, the judge set down his gavel. "We will have order," he declared, though his voice carried a tremor. "We will examine all the evidence properly, and we will get to the truth." Breaths were held, hearts still pounded. Timothy steadied himself, noticing the sweat dripping from his forehead. He clutched his dog tags so hard that their edges dug into his palm, reminding him that he was real, that his Rye was real, and that no matter how harshly he was judged, he still had dignity. He inhaled deeply, wincing at the ache in his injured shoulder. In that explosive moment of noise and shouting, the hush of minutes ago seemed like a distant memory. Timothy closed his eyes, trying to steady himself. He knew how quickly panic could seize him if he let it, but he also knew he needed to speak up, needed to stand up for himself. He felt a burst of energy well up in his chest, fueling him with a sense of purpose. He looked at the judge, who was shouting for everyone to quiet down. Then Timothy's gaze shifted to the crowd, to the suspicious faces and the few sympathetic ones. He saw the assistant prosecutor holding the slip of paper that had changed everything. And he saw the woman in the business suit, her lips pressed tight, still clutching her folder of documents. Suddenly, he felt a surge of courage he hadn't felt in years. Timothy reached into the collar of his worn-out shirt and pulled out the chain with his dog tags. With a trembling hand, he held them up for all to see. The metal caught the overhead lights, glinting as if answering a silent call. This was his story, his life, and for better or worse, he would fight to claim it. That's when a voice near the front of the court, sounding high-pitched with alarm, cried out, "Your Honor, watch out!" Timothy spun around just in time to see the husky man in the dark jacket pushing through the crowd, a furious look on his face. Judge Browning tried to slam his gavel again, but it was too late. The man lunged forward, and the entire courtroom erupted in screams. Chairs toppled over, people scrambled to get away, and everything descended into a flurry of chaos. In the middle of it all, Timothy stood frozen, dog tags clenched in his hand, as the man charged toward him with wild eyes. Timothy heard his own heartbeat roaring in his ears, and his training instincts kicked in like a reflex. He turned slightly, positioning himself in a defensive stance. But before he could react, two bailiffs and a police officer tackled the raging man, bringing him crashing to the ground mere feet from Timothy. The man's fingers clawed at the air, fury etched on his face, yelling something incoherent. Judge Browning rose from his seat, slamming the gavel repeatedly in an attempt to restore order. "Everybody, remain calm," he shouted. The prosecutor's assistant stumbled back, nearly knocking over a large stack of papers. The onlookers huddled together, frightened by the sudden outbreak of violence. Timothy found himself trembling, not just from the shock of almost being attacked, but also from the flood of memories that soared back, the chaos of battle, the unpredictability of life on the streets. Within seconds, the bailiffs had the man pinned down. He was shouting insults at Timothy, claiming that people like him were fakers who took advantage of the system. Timothy's body shook with adrenaline. He saw Judge Browning's expression shift rapidly from confusion to horror, then to fierce authority as he ordered the man to be removed from the courtroom. The officer dragged the man out, still yelling threats and curses that echoed in the hallway until the doors finally slammed shut behind them. The room fell into a stunned silence once more, but it was a different kind of silence this time, one charged with the weight of what had just happened. Everyone looked at Judge Browning, whose face was pale, eyes darting between Timothy and the door. At last, clearing his throat, the judge set down his gavel. "We will have order," he declared, though his voice carried a tremor. "We will examine all the evidence properly, and we will get to the truth." Breaths were held, hearts still pounded. Timothy steadied himself, noticing the sweat dripping from his forehead. He clutched his dog tags so hard that their edges dug into his palm, reminding him that he was real, that his Rye was real, and that no matter how harshly he was judged, he still had dignity. He inhaled deeply, wincing at the ache in his injured shoulder. Judge Browning glanced toward the woman in the business suit, who looked like she wanted to approach Timothy, but was hesitant to move without permission. The judge nodded slightly, and she inched forward. Timothy watched her come closer, not knowing what to expect next, especially after a scene like that. The hush in the courtroom was disorienting. It was as though everyone was waiting to see if something else shocking would happen, if the tension would explode again, or if calm might finally settle in. All eyes shifted once more to Timothy, the man who had been scolded and humiliated for simply existing. Now, his status as a decorated war veteran hung in the air, raising questions of how and why the system failed him. Judge Browning kept staring, and it was clear from his expression he was grappling with regret. His eyes flickered to the file, to Timothy's dog tags, and to the new chaos swirling around the case. Then, in a voice barely louder than a whisper but echoing throughout the hushed room, Judge Browning said, "Mr. Grant, He paused, as though searching for the right words. But before he could speak again, someone at the back of the courtroom let out a piercing scream. Heads whipped around, eyes widening in shock. Another wave of panic rippled through the crowd. A woman clutching her chest staggered and collapsed to the ground near the entrance. Her purse spilled across the floor, scattering papers, a phone, and small items everywhere. A few people rushed to her side, calling for help. Timothy watched in alarm, his heart pounding again, not sure if this was yet another threat or a sudden medical emergency. Judge Browning stood up abruptly, and the bailiff hurried over, shouting for someone to call 911. Just like that, the calm dissolved into urgent chaos. People jostled and bumped into each other, some trying to get out of the way, others trying to help. The woman lay there, still, eyes closed. The last glimpse Timothy had of her before a frantic knot of bystanders blocked his view was a face marked by fear. He could hear her labored breathing, faint and uneven. With sirens already wailing in the distance, Timothy found himself stepping forward, drawn by an instinct to assist, just as he had been trained to do so many years ago. Nobody knew what was about to happen next, but in that swirling moment of confusion, the trial, the accusations, and all the tension hovered in mid-air, waiting to crash down like a wave on the shore. Timothy, Judge Browning, and everyone else in that packed room were suddenly united by a single question. Would the woman survive? And if she did, would the shocking events of the last few minutes finally come to a head? The sound of approaching ambulance sirens grew louder, echoing in the courthouse corridors. Hearts raced, eyes darted around in worry. Timothy was about to push through the crowd, wanting to see if he could help her, to do something, anything. He clenched his dog tags again, that small piece of metal which tied his turbulent past to his uncertain present. He thought of how life could turn in an instant, from calm to chaos, from scorn to respect, or from innocence to blame. And in that flash of realization, the screaming halted, replaced by ragged breathing and urgent voices calling for space. No one noticed that Timothy was no longer at the defendant's table. He had moved to the back, kneeling beside the unconscious woman, prepared to do what his old training taught him, if needed. The paramedics burst through the doors, and as they raced toward her, Timothy locked eyes one more time with Judge Browning. The judge nodded ever so slightly, as if giving permission for Timothy to help, or acknowledging that maybe, just maybe, he had been wrong all along. The paramedics surrounded the woman, and as they prepared to lift her onto a stretcher, the entire courtroom held its breath. Timothy hovered close, the swirl of voices and lights dancing in his vision. He wanted to help her, but the paramedics did their jobs swiftly, each movement precise. At last, they hurried her out, and the doors slammed shut behind them, leaving only a faint echo in the corridor. Judge Browning cleared his throat, trying to regain composure. "We'll take a short recess," he said, though the authority in his tone wavered. People immediately began murmuring, unsure whether to stay or go. The bailiff's voice rang out, instructing everyone to remain until the judge returned. Timothy found himself standing near the doorway, chest heaving, mind spinning from everything that had just happened, and that's when he felt a heavy hand on his shoulder. He turned, half expecting another attack. Instead, he found the woman in the business suit gazing at him with a mixture of awe and worry. She looked like she wanted to speak, but her lips only moved soundlessly at first. Finally, she said, "There's so much you need to know about your case, about what's been happening. But first, are you okay?" Timothy opened his mouth to reply, but no words came. He simply nodded, feeling more uncertain than ever. He glanced toward the judge's bench, which now sat empty. He could almost feel the weight of the judge's scolding echo in the chamber. Everything that had erupted in the last hour being yelled at, exposed as a veteran, nearly attacked by a stranger, and witnessing a woman collapse flooded his brain like a torrent. Yet something about this woman's expression told him that the surprises were far from over. She looked as though she had a secret to share, one that could either help him or place him in more trouble than he had ever imagined. The tension in her eyes made Timothy's heart flutter with anxious anticipation. Would she finally reveal something that could save him, or would it further complicate the tangled mess his life had become? At that moment, just as the crowd began to disperse to the hallways for the recess, the door where the paramedics had gone burst open again. A police officer stepped in, eyes wide with urgency. He scanned the room and spotted Timothy immediately. Then, he shouted in a shaky voice that carried across the entire courtroom, "Mr. Grant, we need you. Come quickly." A wave of confusion and dread washed over Timothy. The woman in the business suit clutched his arm, her eyes darting between him and the officer. The onlookers, who were slowly making their way out, stopped in their tracks and turned around. Judge Browning, who had been about to exit through his private chamber door, froze, his robe swishing around his ankles as he turned to see what the commotion was. Timothy had no idea what awaited him, but he knew this was another pivotal moment, one that could shift everything in a split second. His heart hammered in his chest as he followed the officer, weaving through the gawking crowd. Every step echoed in the silent hush, each footfall like a drumbeat signaling that something big was about to happen. Eyes trailed after him, and he could sense the swirl of rumors spreading among the spectators, fueling their curiosity. Nobody knew whether this sudden call was about the collapsed woman or something else entirely. All Timothy could do was brace himself for whatever waited on the other side of those courthouse doors, his mind racing with 1,000 possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. The second those doors swung open, he stepped into a blur of flashing emergency lights, rushing paramedics, and frantic voices. It felt as though the world was holding its breath, waiting for a climax that might change Mothy's fate forever. And then, just as the swirl of confusion reached its peak, and Timothy found himself face to face with a scene that would etch itself into his mind, the unthinkable happened. A piercing shriek tore through the night air and someone yelled, "No! No, not again!" Everything seemed to stop in that moment, The panic, the swirling lights, the voices calling out instructions. Timothy's stomach dropped, a wave of dread pulling him under. He had no clue what he was about to see, but the horror in that scream told him it would be something he could never unsee. His throat went dry, his knees threatened to buckle. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he heard the echo of Judge Browning's scolding words, the startled gasps of the courtroom upon learning he was a war hero, and the woman's collapsed form being whisked away by paramedics. All these images and sounds melted into a single knot of tension. He felt as though he was standing on the edge of a crumbling cliff, about to plunge into darkness. And that's when he realized he had no choice but to move forward to face whatever awaited him outside. Timothy glanced back over his shoulder. The door was still open, and through it, he saw Judge Browning in the distance, watching him with a stern but conflicted look. The woman in the business suit gripped the handle, looking torn between following him and staying behind. All the while, the swirling red and blue lights illuminated Timothy's face like a spotlight, highlighting the fear in his eyes. He swallowed hard, turned again toward the commotion, and took one resolute step forward. No one could have predicted the sight that met him beyond those doors, a sight so shocking that the entire course of this already chaotic day would change in an instant.